How many times over the past few days have you heard some variation of the same argument repeated with absolute confidence? That the Iran war was not just controversial, not just risky, but a strategic failure for the United States. That by engaging in this conflict, Washington has fundamentally reshaped the geopolitical landscape in one very specific and dangerous way. The claim goes something like this. For decades, arguably centuries, the Strait of Hormuz stood as one of the most important and reliably open maritime choke points in the world. A narrow passageway, yes, but one governed by a widely accepted principle: the idea of freedom of navigation. Oil tankers, cargo ships, and naval vessels passed through it with the understanding that, regardless of tensions on land, global trade would continue to flow. And then, according to this narrative, everything changed. By initiating the Iran war, the United States didn't just attack military targets or degrade infrastructure. It taught Iran, more specifically, whoever sits at the top of its political and military hierarchy, that the Strait of Hormuz is not just a geographic feature. It is a weapon, a lever, a tool of coercion. The logic is simple and at first glance compelling. Iran doesn't actually need to permanently destroy shipping lanes or maintain a sustained blockade. It only needs to convince the world that it is willing to disrupt them. A handful of threats, a few targeted attacks on tankers, and suddenly, the risk calculations of every shipping company, every insurer, and every energy importing nation begin to shift. Oil prices spike, markets panic, governments scramble, and in that moment, Iran gains leverage far beyond its conventional military capabilities. According to this view, the consequences are profound. Entire economies could be pushed toward recession. Energy importing countries might feel compelled to pressure their allies or even make concessions to avoid further disruption. The global system, deeply dependent on stable energy flows, becomes vulnerable to a single actor willing to exploit that dependency. The phrase you'll often hear is, "The genie is out of the bottle." Once a country has demonstrated, or even just operationalized, the ability to weaponize a choke point like Hormuz, there is no putting that knowledge back, no returning to the old assumptions. Now, I want to be clear about something. I am not here to argue that the Iran war was a good idea. Evaluating that properly would require answering a long list of incredibly difficult questions. Questions that, frankly, none of us have the data to answer with confidence. How much Iranian military infrastructure was actually destroyed? How quickly can Iran rebuild what it lost? Did the conflict weaken Iran's long-term capabilities or strengthen its resolve? What did it cost the United States in terms of munitions, readiness, and strategic positioning? How fast can those stockpiles be replenished? And perhaps most importantly, how does all of this interact with other global flashpoints, like the timeline of a potential Chinese move on Taiwan? Each of these questions is complex enough to deserve its own deep dive. Each depends on classified information, uncertain projections, and future developments that we simply cannot predict with precision. So rather than getting lost in that maze, let's focus on something much narrower and ultimately much more answerable. What has the world actually lost as a result of Iran learning the power of closing the Strait of Hormuz? If you listen to the dominant narrative, the answer is quite a lot. But if you take a step back and examine the logic more carefully, a different answer emerges. And that answer is basically nothing. Now that might sound counterintuitive, After all, we've seen countless analyses, opinion pieces, and expert panels warning about exactly this scenario. The idea that Iran now holds a kind of economic sword of Damocles over the global system is everywhere. But there are two fundamental problems with this line of thinking. The first is what we might call a fallacy of knowledge, and the second is a confusion between the current conflict and a hypothetical future scenario in which Iran attempts to use this tactic offensively rather than defensively. Understanding these two issues is crucial, not just for evaluating this specific situation, but for making sense of how strategic narratives form and spread more broadly. So let's start with the first problem, the fallacy of knowledge. In fact, this is such a recurring issue that it deserves a proper name. Let's call it the amateur's fallacy. The amateur's fallacy occurs when someone encounters a piece of information, often through a dramatic real-world event, and assumes that this information is new, not just new to them, but new to everyone, including the experts, policymakers, and strategists who operate in that domain. In reality, however, those experts were already well aware of the underlying principle. The event didn't reveal something unknown. It merely demonstrated something that had long been understood in theory. We've seen this pattern play out recently in the nuclear domain. There's a growing argument that recent conflicts have proven once and for all that nuclear weapons are the ultimate guarantee of national survival, that countries without them are vulnerable to regime change or invasion, while those with them are effectively untouchable. From this perspective, the conclusion seems obvious. More countries will now rush to acquire nuclear weapons. No one, the argument goes, will want to repeat the so-called Ukraine mistake or Iran mistake. But here's the problem with that reasoning. The people who actually make decisions about nuclear weapons, national security officials, military planners, political leaders, already knew this. They didn't need a recent war to tell them that nuclear deterrence can prevent certain types of attacks. That idea has been central to strategic thinking since the early days of the Cold War. Countries that have chosen not to pursue nuclear weapons didn't do so because they were unaware of their benefits. They made that choice because, in their specific circumstances, the costs, economic, political, diplomatic, and security-related, outweighed those benefits. And those calculations are not suddenly being rewritten overnight. The new insight that amateurs believe they've discovered was already baked into the decision-making frameworks of experts all along. And this brings us back to the Strait of Hormuz. Because the exact same logic applies here. The idea that closing the Strait of Hormuz would cause massive disruption to the global economy is not some newly discovered insight that Iranian leadership stumbled upon in the middle of a war. It is not a clever trick that was just unlocked through recent experience. It has been one of the most obvious strategic realities in international politics for decades. You do not need to observe something happening in real time to understand its consequences, especially when those consequences are as straightforward as this. We rely on theory, modeling, and basic reasoning all the time to predict outcomes in situations we have never directly witnessed. For example, we do not need to actually watch an astronaut remove their helmet during a spacewalk on the far side of the moon to know that it would end badly. The physics are well understood. The outcome is not in doubt. We do not need to see a scenario in which Taiwan deliberately destroys its own semiconductor manufacturing facilities to know that such an action would send shockwaves through the global economy. The dependence is clear. The consequences are predictable. We do not need to send a human traveling at 90+% the speed of light to a distant star like Tau Ceti to understand how time dilation would affect their journey relative to observers on Earth The math has already been done. And in exactly the same way, we do not need to witness the full closure of the Strait of Hormuz to know that it would create chaos in global energy markets. The dependency of the global economy on that narrow waterway is not a secret. It is one of the most widely discussed vulnerabilities in the entire international system, which makes a certain contradiction in the public narrative all the more striking. On one hand, you will hear commentators say that everyone understood the Strait of Hormuz was a critical choke point, a nightmare scenario if disrupted. That policymakers, analysts, and even the general public were well aware of the risks. Sometimes this point is even used to criticize leadership decisions. The argument goes that everyone knew how dangerous this could be, and yet the situation was allowed to escalate anyway. But then, almost immediately afterward, the narrative shifts. Suddenly, we are told that Iran has now learned the power of closing the strait, that this is a new strategic reality, that we are entering a brave new world in which Iran possesses a form of leverage it did not previously understand. These two claims cannot both be true. Either the danger was obvious to everyone, including Iranian leadership, or it was some kind of hidden insight waiting to be discovered through trial and error. You cannot argue that the risk was universally understood while also claiming that one of the most strategically invested actors in the region was somehow unaware of it. And this is where the amateur's fallacy shows up again. What has actually happened is not that Iran learned something new. What has happened is that a broader audience has observed a real-world manifestation of a known risk and mistaken that observation for discovery. But Iranian planners, military strategists, and political leaders have been thinking about the Strait of Hormuz in these terms for a very long time. It has always been part of their strategic toolkit. It has always been one of the primary ways in which Iran could compensate for its relative conventional military disadvantages. If anything, the idea has been so well understood that it has shaped behavior for years, on all sides. And if you want a concrete example that does not rely on abstract reasoning, you do not even have to look very far. You can look just across the Arabian Peninsula. Roughly a couple of years ago, the Houthi movement in Yemen, an actor that is not even a fully recognized state, and one that relies heavily on Iranian support, demonstrated how vulnerable maritime choke points can be. By seizing a vessel and issuing credible threats, they were able to significantly disrupt shipping through the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. This is a much smaller and less globally critical choke point than Hormuz, and yet the impact was still substantial enough to force changes in shipping routes and raise concerns across international markets. Now think about what that implies. If a relatively limited, state-like actor with constrained resources can create that level of disruption, what does that say about a country like Iran? A country with a more developed military, greater resources, and a direct geographic position along one of the most important waterways in the world. It does not take an advanced degree in strategic studies or a room full of defense analysts to connect those dots. The capability was obvious, the potential impact was obvious, and the strategic logic behind using that capability was obvious. There is a reason why policymakers and analysts have long referred to the idea of closing the Strait of Hormuz as a kind of nuclear option, not because it involves nuclear weapons, but because of its scale and its consequences. It is an extreme measure, one that carries enormous risks, not just for the target, but for the actor employing it. And that brings us to a crucial point that often gets overlooked in these discussions. Just because a strategy is available does not mean it is useful in all situations. In fact, the very characteristics that make closing the strait so powerful are the same ones that make it highly constrained as a tool of coercion. This is where we begin to transition into the second major problem with the dominant narrative: the conflation of the current situation with a hypothetical future scenario. Right now, Iran's actions are being interpreted through the lens of an ongoing conflict, one in which many observers see Iran as responding to external pressure or aggression. Whether that perception is accurate or not is almost beside the point. What matters is that perception shapes how the rest of the world reacts. At the moment, a significant portion of the international community, and importantly, large segments of public opinion in key countries, view the United States as the primary instigator of the crisis. Within the United States itself, many voters see the conflict as unnecessary, costly, and lacking a clear strategic payoff. They connect rising fuel prices and economic uncertainty directly to decisions made by political leadership. So when disruptions occur, when tankers are threatened, when infrastructure is targeted, the blame is not assigned in a vacuum. It is filtered through an existing narrative about cause and effect. People may not like Iran. They may strongly oppose its government and its regional behavior, but they still see a sequence of events: US action, followed by Iranian response. And that sequence matters because it creates a very different environment than one in which Iran acts first. And that difference is everything. And that difference is everything. Because the effectiveness of any coercive strategy, whether it involves military force, economic pressure, or control over critical infrastructure, does not depend solely on capability. It depends on context. More specifically, it depends on how other actors interpret what is happening. So let's take the argument we've been discussing and extend it into the future. Imagine that the current conflict ends, tensions cool down, the Strait of Hormuz reopens fully, and global shipping returns to something resembling normalcy. Oil prices stabilize, markets recover, politicians move on to the next crisis, and then, sometime later, a completely different situation arises. Perhaps Israel launches a new military operation in Lebanon, or Saudi Arabia escalates its campaign against the Houthis in Yemen, or some other regional dispute flares up, one in which Iran is not directly attacked, but strongly disagrees with the actions of another state. According to the dominant narrative, this is where the lesson of the Iran war kicks in. Iran, having now learned the power of closing the Strait of Hormuz, decides to use it as a tool of coercion. It threatens global shipping. Maybe it targets a few tankers. Maybe it announces restrictions on transit. The goal is simple: force other countries to change their behavior by imposing economic pain on the entire world. At first glance, this seems plausible. After all, if the tactic worked once, why wouldn't it work again? But this is where the second major flaw in the argument becomes clear, because this scenario is fundamentally different from the one we are currently living through. In this hypothetical future, Iran is not responding to a direct attack. It is not acting in the immediate context of a war initiated by another power. Instead, it is inserting itself into a situation and escalating it. In other words, it becomes the instigator. And that changes everything about how the rest of the world reacts. Right now, as we discussed, there is a significant portion of global opinion that traces the current crisis back to decisions made in Washington. Even if people disapprove of Iran's actions, they still see them as part of a chain reaction. But in this future scenario, that chain is broken. There is no initial strike on Iran to point to. There is no immediate justification that can be framed as retaliation. Instead, there is a clear and visible decision by Iran to disrupt one of the most critical arteries of the global economy in response to events that do not directly threaten its own survival. And that is a completely different story. In that situation, the international community is far less likely to show restraint. Countries that might currently be hesitant to escalate would face much stronger pressure, both domestically and internationally, to respond. Energy importing nations in Europe and Asia would not see this as a distant geopolitical dispute. They would see it as a direct attack on their economic stability. Shipping companies and insurers would demand protection. Political leaders would be under intense pressure to act, and crucially, the narrative would shift. Instead of asking what triggered this response, the question would become how do we stop Iran from doing this again? We have seen versions of this dynamic before. During the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, both sides engaged in what became known as the Tanker War, targeting oil shipments in the Persian Gulf. But despite the intensity of that conflict, and despite having both the capability and the incentive, Iran stopped short of fully closing the Strait of Hormuz. Why? Because Iranian leadership understood exactly what would happen if they did. Even though Iraq had initiated the war by invading Iranian territory, closing the strait would have been seen by the broader international community as an escalation that crossed a line. It would have transformed Iran from a victim of aggression into a threat to the global system. And that transformation would have invited direct intervention. In fact, Iraq had a strong incentive to provoke Iran into taking that step, precisely because it would have triggered a backlash against Tehran. That logic has not changed. If anything, it has become even more pronounced in today's more interconnected global economy. Now let's bring this back to the present and think through what would happen if Iran attempted to use the Strait of Hormuz as a coercive tool in the future. The immediate effect: rising oil prices, disrupted shipping, economic anxiety, would look very similar to what we see today. But in a future scenario where Iran unilaterally disrupts global shipping, that perception flips. The source of the problem becomes external. The blame shifts. And with that shift comes a change in what voters are willing to support. Policies that might be politically risky today, stronger military action, more aggressive economic measures, become much easier to justify. The same is true in other countries. Governments that are currently cautious would find themselves under pressure to respond more forcefully. Alliances would tighten, and the range of acceptable actions would expand. In that environment, closing the Strait of Hormuz stops being a one-sided pressure tactic. It becomes something closer to mutually assured economic destruction. Iran can hurt the world, but the world can hurt Iran right back, and with far greater cumulative force, which is why the analogy to a nuclear option is actually quite fitting. Not because it guarantees success, but because it is so extreme that using it fundamentally changes the strategic landscape, and usually not in a way that benefits the actor who pulls the trigger. And that brings us to the final piece of the puzzle. Because once you strip away the noise, the headlines, and the repetition of that now familiar argument, what you are left with is a much simpler and much more grounded understanding of what is actually going on. The claim we started with was that the world has fundamentally changed because Iran has learned something new, that by observing or executing disruptions in the Strait of Hormuz, Iran has unlocked a form of coercive power that it did not previously possess. But by now, it should be clear why that framing does not hold up. Iran did not learn this yesterday. Iran did not learn this during the current war. Iran has known this for decades, and more importantly, everyone else has known it too. The Strait of Hormuz has always been one of the most strategically significant choke points on the planet. Its vulnerability has been studied, modeled, debated, and wargamed by policymakers, militaries, and analysts across the globe. It has been factored into energy policy, naval strategy, and contingency planning for years. So the idea that we are suddenly living in a new world because this reality has become visible to a wider audience is, at its core, a misunderstanding. What has changed is not the underlying strategic balance. What has changed is the visibility of certain dynamics to people who were not previously paying attention. And that distinction matters, because when people mistake visibility for novelty, they tend to draw the wrong conclusions. They assume that a new risk has emerged, when in fact an old risk has simply been demonstrated. They assume that an adversary has gained new capabilities, when in reality, those capabilities were already present. And if you found this breakdown useful, you know the drill. Stay curious, keep questioning the obvious, and I will see you in the next one.